Welcome to another episode of the History Podcast. Human creativity is amazing. On a mere sliver of earth, we are able to create beautiful and magnificent buildings. Using our intelligence and skill, we produce amazing craftsmanship practically from scratch. And although noteworthy buildings are being constructed all around us almost every day, there are moments in history when something surpasses everything else, and we find it worthy of recording it in the pages of history. Then such an achievement is given the title of a world wonder. It becomes a true celebration of human creativity. I don't know about you, but I have loved the theme of the 7 wonders of the world since I was a kid. I think it's just because they are wondrous. The name simply plays on my imagination, but neither I nor our ancient ancestors used the word miracle hastily in describing them. Many engineers today would still struggle to replicate these ancient feats. Just think. These wonders were created at a time when there were no large-scale machines, no computers, no architectural programs. There wasn't even as much developed mathematics and physics, and yet they still managed to be planned and executed. There are many wonders of the world, the ancient ones as well as the later ones. I will tell you today about all of them. Each wonder of the world has a distinct history, as well as its own secrets. The history of each teaches us something. They are different, yet they all have one thing in common. They are proof that it is worthwhile to aim high. This is how I think about the wonders of the world, and I hope that you too will share my opinion after listening to today's episode. So, let's start our time machine. We go back in time more than 2,000 years. The then conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE was an epic feat that actually drew a new map of the world for decades to come. But it changed reality in yet another way. It gave Greek travelers access to the civilization of the Egyptian, Persians, and Babylonians, and these civilizations really had a lot to be proud of. The ancient travelers suddenly saw that there was a real wealth of technological and scientific achievements in the world. Fascinated and captivated by the monuments and wonders of various lands, they began to write down what they had seen in order to commemorate and preserve them from oblivion. The word miracle itself is a tad inaccurate. The ancient Greeks did not think of miracles as something almost divine. Oh no, it's a bit like saying today that some modern skyscraper in the center of a city is a miracle. Instead of miracles, the ancient Greeks spoke of tiema, which means sights. In other words, things to see, things worth seeing. Hence, the list of the wonders of the world as we know it today and in the ancient world were the equivalent of tourist guides or a list of attractions that were a must-see while in a particular region. Antipater of Sidon, who lived in the 2nd century BC, compiled such a list of 7 wonders, so let us give him the floor. I gazed at the walls of unconquered Babylon, along which chariots can race, and at Zeus on the banks of the Alps. I saw the hanging gardens, and the Colossus of Helios, the man-made lofty pyramids, and the giant tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the sacred house of Artemis towering above the clouds, the others were immediately in shadow. Even the sun itself never looked at an equal outside of Olympus. Another ancient writer, Philon of Byzantium, also wrote a short account entitled 7 Sights Worth Seeing in the World. The surviving manuscript is incomplete, missing the last pages. Despite this, we can infer from the text that the list of 7 sights exactly coincides with that of Antipater. Earlier and later lists of wonders by Herodotus and Callimachus of Cyrene have survived only as mentions. The lists of the 7 wonders that have survived to the present day only cover the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern regions. This is because at that time they represented the entire known world for the Greeks. 5 of the 7 items on the list are celebrations of Greek building achievements. The exceptions are the pyramids at Giza and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And it is interesting to note that the Colossus of Rhodes was the last of the 7 wonders to be completed after 280 BC and the first to be destroyed by an earthquake in 226 BC. Therefore, all 7 wonders of the world existed at the same time, which was during a short period, less than 60 years together. So I present to you the 7 wonders of the ancient world. I promise it will be a truly epic journey. We begin with a unique miracle. Exceptional, because it is the only one that still exists today, and you can still see it with your own eyes. In front of you is the Great Pyramid of Giza, known as the Pyramid of Cheops. The Great Pyramid is the oldest and largest of the three pyramids at Giza, bordering present-day Cairo in Egypt. The pyramid was a tomb for a pharaoh called Cheops. That is why the Great Pyramid is sometimes referred to as the Pyramid of Cheops. The enormous size of the Great Pyramid represents a challenge to anyone trying to explain how it could have been built. It is estimated to consist of almost 2.5 million stone blocks, weighing at an average of 2.5 tons each. On top of this, other blocks weighing much more lie deep within the pyramid. The height of the pyramid was 146 meters. The Great Pyramid does not stand alone. It is the main part of a larger complex of buildings, which consists of two burial temples in honor of Cheops, one close to the pyramid and the other near the Nile. Three smaller pyramids for Cheops' wives, and an even smaller size pyramid, as well as an elevated footbridge connecting the two temples. Small tombs were also built near the so-called mastabas, in which pharaoh's dignitaries were to rest. The mastabas were shaped like a truncated pyramid in the middle. They look a bit like someone built a pyramid halfway up. A few hundred meters from the Great Pyramid lies a slightly smaller pyramid known as Hefren, which is one of Cheops' successors. Hefren is widely regarded as the builder of the Great Sphinx. 100 meters away on the other side is the Pyramid of Mykrianos, the successor of Hefren, which is about half as tall. Given the scale of the undertaking to build all of that I have just mentioned, Giza was home to all of the construction facilities: a small town for the workers, a cemetery, bakery, beer hall, and a copper smelting complex. The size of these facilities is not surprising. One has to take into account that the construction of all these buildings took 20 years. Over this period, the greatest amount of time was devoted to the Great Pyramid of Cheops. Written accounts of Egyptian engineering methods are very scarce, and the debate about how the Great Pyramid was built has been going on for centuries. Many alternative, often contradictory theories have been put forward about the pyramid's construction techniques. There is no complete consensus on whether the stone blocks were dragged, carried, or even rolled into place, and there are also many doubts about the methods by which they were put into place. However, we have quite convincing arguments for certain claims about what we know for sure. The Great Pyramid was built from blocks of limestone, basalt, and granite. Its core was made mainly of raw blocks of low-quality limestone sourced from a quarry nearby. These blocks weighed at an average of 2 to 4 tons, with the heaviest being used at the base of the pyramid. High-quality limestone, some blocks of which weighed as much as 15 tons, were used to build the outer visible part. The limestone came from the Tura quarry, 14 kilometers away from the pyramid. The granite blocks, on the other hand, weighing 50 to 70 tons, were the most difficult to obtain. They were imported from Aswan, 800 kilometers away. The granite blocks were highly ornate and were used to build the king's chamber and the entrance chambers. The total mass of the pyramid is estimated at 6 million tons, and the volume is 2.6 million cubic meters. These are truly colossal values. I don't even have much to compare them to. The Titanic, for example, weighed 52,000 tons. A single World Trade Center tower was 250,000 tons. Even the world's largest skyscraper, the 800-meter Burj Khalifa, weighs 500,000 tons. These are still negligible values next to the Pyramid of Cheops. It is the largest pyramid in Egypt and the largest in the world in terms of volume, surpassed only by the Great Pyramid in Mexico, but it is considerably lower. The Great Pyramid at the end of its construction was decorated with diagonally cut but flat-top blocks of foliated white limestone. These made the structure shine brightly in the sun and could be seen at a great distance. The cover stones of the Great Pyramid and the Sefron Pyramid were chiseled with such precision and were so perfectly fitted together that to this day it is impossible to even put the tip of a knife between them. Today, not much remains of these shield or facade stones. In the 14th century, a powerful earthquake loosened many of them, which then fell off and were taken away to build mosques and fortresses in nearby Cairo. These stones can still be seen today as part of these structures. For many years, explorers and travelers have reported huge piles of rubble at the base of the pyramid, resulting from the fall of the facade stones. How then was such a majestic building constructed so long ago? Many different estimates have even been devoted to the manpower needed to build the Great Pyramid. It was long thought that the pyramids were built by slaves. More recently, however, evidence has been found that suggests the contrary. No one was forced to build, and laborers were paid. This in turn adds accounting and supervisory elements to the whole enterprise. For many years, estimates on how many people actually worked on the pyramid's construction were downright astronomical. Herodot estimated that the construction may have required 100,000 workers over a period of 20 years. Architect Wisław Kozinski estimated that around 20 people were needed to transport one stone block weighing 1.3 tons. On this basis, he calculated the number of workers to be 300,000 on-site and an additional 60,000 off-site. 19th century Egyptologist William Flinders Petrie argued that the workforce largely consisted not of slaves, but of rural Egyptians working during periods when the Nile was flooding and agricultural activity was suspended. As the land was then expected to dry up, there were free hands to work. Over the years, these estimates fell and became more realistic. Egyptologist Marislav Werner claimed that the labor force was two groups of 100,000 men each. The mathematician Kurt Mendelssohn reckoned that it amounted to 50,000 men at most, while Ludwig and Louis Bouchard set the figure at 36,000. It is actually difficult to estimate how someone built something as complex as a Great Pyramid a few thousand years ago. The consensus came in 1999, quite recently. At that time, a precise study was carried out by the company Daniel Mann Johnson and Mendel Hall in cooperation with Egyptologists. On the basis of these, it was estimated that the entire project to build the pyramid complex required 14,567 workers. At its peak, there may have been no more than 40,000 of them. Assuming that no pulleys or iron tools were used, the Great Pyramid could have been completed in about 10 years. So what did the Pyramid of Cheops look like at the height of its power? At the time of construction, the Great Pyramid was 146 meters high, but due to the theft of its tallest stone, the so-called pyramidion, its current height is 7 meters less, just under 139 meters. Today, each side of the pyramid is approximately 230 meters long, and the base covers 36,000 meters squared. For 4 millennia, the Great Pyramid was the tallest building in the world unsurpassed until the 160-meter spire of Lincoln Cathedral in England was built in 13,000 AD. But the Great Pyramid is not only fascinating from the outside, there are also many mysteries waiting within. It differs in its internal layout from other pyramids in the area, distinguished by a great number of passages and chambers, a beautiful finish, and precision and accuracy in construction. The walls throughout the pyramid's interior are completely blank and without inscriptions. There is, however, an exception. Researchers have discovered something like a small graffiti that is believed to have been made by workers on the stones before they were laid. The most famous inscription from one such graffiti is one of the few that directly mentions the name of Cheops. It inscribes the 17-year reign of Cheops, and I will talk about these inscriptions a little later on. Inside the Great Pyramid, there were 3 chambers and are arranged on 3 levels. The lowest chamber, being the so-called unfinished chamber, is cut into the rock on which the pyramid was later built. This chamber is the largest of the 3, but is completely unfinished, with only a rough rouge in the rock. Egyptologists regard these chambers as a mere change of plans. It was most likely intended to be the original burial chamber, but apparently Cheops changed his mind, wanting his tomb to be higher up in the pyramid. The middle chamber or queen chamber is the smallest. It measures roughly 5 by 5 by 5 meters. In the south and north walls of this chamber are rectangular openings leading to narrow blind channels or shafts 20 centimeters wide, extending from the chamber towards the outer surface of the pyramid. Imagine a Y shape. This is roughly how this chamber looked, and its narrow canals going from its center diagonally to the sides. These canals were exposed using a robot. As it turns out, limestone slabs blocking the continuation of these shafts were encountered along the way. A small hole was drilled, But another larger limestone slab was discovered. Egyptologist Mark Einer believes that the Queen's Chamber was intended as a serdab, or small chamber inside the pyramid, housing the inner tomb statue of the deceased, usually situated in the southern part of the tomb. The serdab was walled off and completely isolated from its other rooms. The true purpose of the Queen's Chamber remains a mystery to this day. At the end of a long series of entranceways leading to the interior of the pyramid is the main chamber. The ceremonial chamber of the king was originally 5 by 10 by 6 meters. In the center of the king's chamber is a magnificent sarcophagus, which was hollowed out of a single piece of red Aslanian granite and proved too large to fit through the passageway leading to the king's chamber. We do not know whether this sarcophagus was ever intended to house a body, as it is too short to accommodate a person of average height without bending them at the knees, a technique that was not practiced in Egyptian burials, nor has a lid ever been found for the sarcophagus. This is not the end of the mysteries. It has been difficult for researchers and historians to determine how old the pyramids are, because how do you even investigate when such old buildings were built? Someone will say radiocarbon dating, but there is a problem. We cannot directly carbon date the stones from which the pyramids are made. For such a study, we need something organic. Fortunately, in the case of the limestone pyramids, this is a possibility. Thousands of years ago, ash from burnt wood was added to the mortar, so we can take samples of such mortar and carbon date it. This will usually tell us that the wood used for mortar in the construction of the pyramids was burnt in 2500 BC, but some samples give a date several centuries earlier. Why such a big difference? After all, the pyramids were built in 10 to 20 years, right? And now suddenly there's a difference of several centuries. I'll admit this is quite a puzzle for me too, but the solution is very simple. The source of this apparent inconsistency is probably what Egyptologists called the old wood problem. Because Egypt lies in the middle of the desert, organic material lasts well for a very long time. Once a tree has been cut down, you can go back to it even centuries later. Even if it was part of a particular building, you can take it apart and use the wood for another purpose, and it will continue to be in good shape and suitable for construction. This is something that the Egyptians did by recycling very old wood for hundreds of years. Indeed, wood was a very limited resource in Egypt, and this is why wood samples give different results. Radiocarbon dating tells us the date an organism died, not the date in which it was used. So, the wood used for mortar in the pyramids may have been felled centuries earlier. We can date the pyramids in one additional way. The stones in the pyramids were marked with a sort of signature, identifying the mason who made them or the work crew who placed the stone in place. This was an accounting tool supervisors on site could quickly identify who had made the stone or who had placed it in the right place, and could then pay the people involved accordingly. And the marks used on these stones resemble Egyptian writing from exactly the middle of the 3rd millennium BC, combined with other less direct evidence such as paintings on the walls, the excavations in the nearby quarries which seem to be clearly linked to the pyramids, the existence of large labor camps that have no other explanation than the construction of the pyramids. We get many reasons to believe that the pyramids were built around 2500 BC. There is some doubt as to when exactly construction began and how long it lasted, but this is within the margin of error of a few decades, and for such a distant history, that's pretty good. And now is the time for my favorite aspect of the Great Pyramid, the pseudo-history of the Great Pyramid, which over time has become the subject of many speculative or alternative historical theories. These put forward various explanations for its origin, date of construction, and purpose. These are based either on reinterpretation of available data from fields such as archaeology, history, and astronomy, or they refer to biblical, mythological, numerological, astrological, or even esoteric sources of knowledge, sometimes to all of them at the same time. Such ideas have been common since at least the 19th and 20th centuries. One of the earliest examples of this alternative approach to the Great Pyramid is the American clairvoyant Edgar Cayce, who claimed in the early 20th century that the pyramids were built by refugees from Atlantis. The theme of many alternative theories regarding the pyramids at Giza and many other megalithic sites around the world is the theory that they are not the product of known and studied civilizations and cultures, but instead are the much older remains of some unknown advanced ancient culture. And why unknown? Because this theoretical original civilization was supposed to have been destroyed in antiquity by some devastating catastrophe, according to most of these accounts around 10,000 BCE. In the case of the Great Pyramid of Giza, alternative history claims that it was either ordained and built by this now defunct civilization, or that its construction was made possible by now lost knowledge transmitted by this civilization. The existence of this theoretical advanced civilization is postulated as supposedly the only reasonable explanation as to how ancient cultures such as Egypt could have been so far advanced compared to other comparable civilizations of the time. One alternative researcher, John Anthony West, wrote, "How could a civilization emerge fully advanced at once? Just look at a car from 1905 and compare it with this modern car. You can see at once that significant development has taken place over the years, how motoring has changed. But in Egypt, there is no development, no testing. Everything there is perfect from the very beginning." There are also many alternative theories about the pyramids and ancient civilizations. I of course encourage you to research on your own, but remember, the theories that seem to attract are just theories. In the meantime, we are heading off to meet the second wonder of the ancient world. Another world wonder is on the other side of the spectrum, for while the Pyramid of Cheops existed without a shadow of a doubt, because to this day it still stands, the second wonder on the list is shrouded in mystery as to whether it was even on Earth at all. We are talking about the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis, more commonly known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, with their colorful fragrant blossoms of ripe fruit, gushing waterfalls, terraces covered with rich trees and exotic creatures roaming about, may in fact not have existed at all, and may have been just a figment of the imagination of Greek scholars and poets. If they did exist, however, the Hanging Gardens must have been one of the most amazing feats of engineering of the time. These storied gardens were created in the middle of Babylon, drawing water from the Euphrates River to keep the trees, shrubs, and vines alive. The construction of the gardens resembled an artificial mountain and was unlike anything seen before. The great historian Herodotus even wrote, "Babylon surpasses in magnificence any city in the known world." On each of the 7 terraces was a separate garden, yet they formed one coherent whole. The outer edges of the terraces were overgrown with thousands of vines that wound their way towards the lower terraces, creating a 7-tiered green steeple with countless trees, hedges, shrubs, and flowers. It all looked as if the gardens were hanging or floating in the air, hence the name Hanging Gardens. Water was pumped from wells into the many small canals that flowed through all the terraces. There were small springs and waterfalls across the ponds where ducks swam, frogs croaked, bees, butterflies, and dragonflies flew. While Babylon was exposed to the heat of the scorching sun, the fertile gardens flourished unaffected by hot and dry conditions. This vision of the gardens is impressive not only for their beauty, but also for the engineering feat of supplying the massive elevated above-ground gardens with soil and water. The Hanging Gardens have been extensively documented by Greek historians such as Strabon and Diodorus. However, these are not eyewitness accounts, and there is little first-hand evidence of their existence. So, what is the story behind the gardens? During the reign of the famous king Hammurabi in the 18th century BC, the kingdom of Babylonia rose above the cities of Mesopotamia. However, Babylonian civilization did not reach the height of its glory until the rule of Nabopolassar, who started the empire. His son Nebuchadnezzar II, the builder of the legendary Hanging Gardens, is said to have built them to win the favor of his wife Amytis. She grew up in Medi, an ancient country located roughly in the area of northwestern modern Iran. Amytis loved the mountainous surroundings. Nebuchadnezzar wanted Amytis to have a piece of her native country in her new home, so he designed and built the Hanging Gardens for her. Philo of Byzantium, who compiled a list of the 7 wonders of the world, noted that the crops hanging in the gardens were hydroponic. What does this mean? A traditional typical garden, such as in an urban park or by a house, are plants that have roots in the earth. It is from the earth that they draw the necessary nutrients, but also the moisture. This is traditional cultivation. Hydroponic cultivation, on the other hand, is a method in which only water is used to grow the plant. It is to this water that the necessary fertilizer is added, so that the roots can absorb the nutrients and the plants can continue to live. This way of growing plants is even used in space. Philon noted that indeed plants in Babylon were grown above ground, with the roots of the trees embedded in the upper terrace of the garden rather than in the ground. If this is true, it was certainly a very advanced agricultural technique for the time. There are many records of what the gardens looked like. The Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily provided one of the best descriptions of the place. To quote, "The path to the garden was sloped like a hillside, and the various parts of the structure rose from one another rung by rung. On top of all this, the ground was piled up and densely planted with trees of all kinds, which by their size and other charms gave joy to the observer. Water machines from the river secretly carried water in great abundance, and from the outside no one was able to notice." Philon of Byzantium provided additional details. "The garden is quadrangular. The entrance to the highest terraces of the roofs is by stairs. In the hanging garden, plants are grown above ground level, and the roots of the trees are embedded in the upper terrace rather than in the earth. The entire garden mass is supported by stone columns. Streams of water flowing from elevated springs run down sloping channels. These waters irrigate the entire garden, saturating the roots of the plants and keeping the whole area moist. Hence the grass there is constantly green, and the leaves of the trees grow firmly attached to the flexible branches. It is a work of royal luxury, and its most striking feature is that the work of cultivation happens above the heads of the spectators." This is not the end of the enigmas surrounding the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. The location is still not 100% certain. There are no surviving Babylonian texts that even mention the gardens. Furthermore, no archaeological evidence of their existence have been found in Babylon. The stone tablets from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar contained detailed descriptions of the city of Babylon, its walls and palace, but are silent on the subject of the Hanging Gardens. Today, many historians argue that the Hanging Gardens in Babylon simply never existed. I, however, have found 3 theories regarding this world wonder. The first is that the gardens were purely mythical. But why the detailed Greek descriptions I referenced earlier? Well, these descriptions found in ancient Greece and Roman writings depicted unreal gardens, but only a romantic ideal of a Middle Eastern garden. The second theory is that the Semiramis Gardens actually existed in Babylon, but were destroyed around the 1st century BC. The third and final theory is that the legend of the gardens refers to a well-documented garden that the Assyrian king Sennacherib built in one of the Assyrian capitals of Nineveh of the Tigris River near the modern city of Mosul. Let us focus on this first theory. Why do some historians claim that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon never existed? Well, they build on the fact that the warriors of Alexander the Great's army, amazed by the immense prosperity of the flourishing city of Babylon, may have tended to exaggerate in stories what they saw. We can easily imagine this when the soldiers returned to their homeland, and their fellow soldiers were curious to know what they encountered and what wonders were hidden in other lands. After all, in those days there were no photographs to show what one saw on the spot. This is why the only source of accounts of foreign military trips was verbal tales. That is why sometimes exaggerated stories were told of extraordinary gardens, palm trees, impressive buildings, rich and fertile Mesopotamia. All this took place in the land of the fabulous palace of Nebuchadnezzar, the great gate of Ishtar. the legendary Tower of Babel, and other architectural wonders. When all these extraordinary elements of architecture were combined in the imagination of ancient poets, scholars, and historians, perhaps the result of such jumbled relationships could have been an epic but fictional wonder of the world. No archaeological evidence of hanging gardens has been found in Babylon. It is theoretically possible that this evidence could still be hidden under the Euphrates River today and remains an unproven theory. Tell us in the comments section below what you think. Did the gardens actually exist? Meanwhile, we'll move on to the third miracle, a monumental, thoroughly religious epic that was intended to be awe-inspiring by definition. This miracle was the majestic statue of Zeus at Olympia. Zeus. There is a reason why the name of this god is known to everyone, even someone who is not interested in history or religion. Zeus is synonymous with power in Greek mythology and was the highest-ranking god among the entire pantheon of Olympian gods. Zeus is probably the most recognizable figure in all of mythology, and his depiction in art and sculpture. A well-muscled, bearded leader has had a huge impact on the colloquial understanding of the god figure in the Western world. Zeus exercised domination over Mount Olympus, as well as the sky and the thunderbolts. The son of Kronos and Rhea, he was the youngest of his siblings. As a king of the gods, Zeus was supposed to rule everything earthly, directly from the snowy peaks of Mount Olympus. His main attribute was the thunderbolt. He was most often depicted as a muscular old man sitting on a throne holding a thunderbolt in his hand. His sacred tree was the oak and his animal the eagle. He was the protector of earthly possessions and guardian of household objects. Zeus's close relationship with Moias, the goddess of fate, allowed him to know all that is, was, and will be. But it was not everything. Zeus took on the role of guarantor to the social and moral order, judging the behavior of humans as well as gods. It was Zeus who often administered punishments for evil deeds. For example, he sentenced Tantalus to eternal torture for trying to deceive the gods to eat the body of his murdered son. Zeus could be petty and spiteful, and some of the punishments he inflicted were frivolous. On one occasion, for example, Salmoneus imitated Zeus by driving a chariot through the cobbled streets of the city, dragging chains behind to imitate thunder with its rumble. He also threw lighted torches, pretending to be lightning among the crowd. Zeus killed Salmoneus for this prank. No one had the right to make fun of the god above all the gods. Zeus set the rules of morality, patronized hospitality, and looked after the working people, and because he had such a prominent role in the Greek world, he was immortalized on monuments and statues. While there were dozens of them, one stood out for all time amongst the others. Around 430 BC, a great Athenian sculptor unveiled his masterpiece, made of gold and ivory, an unheard-of 13-meter-tall statue depicting Zeus seated in full majesty. Not surprisingly, it very quickly became the most famous statue of the ancient world. Even though the statue itself has not survived, a considerable amount of literature and other evidence attests to its uniqueness. The impression it made on viewers and how famous it was throughout the Mediterranean was significant. The statue was gigantic, occupying half the width of the temple nave. Strabon wrote at the beginning of the 1st century BCE, the statue gives the impression that if only Zeus had risen from his throne and straightened up, he would have pierced the roof of the temple with his head. Here I would like to draw your attention to a very interesting aspect of this miracle. We have no pictures or paintings. So what did the statue look like? We only have approximate but uncertain images on coins and much more detailed records. I have therefore collected a number of such written accounts for you. Listen to the many writers express their admiration for the statue of Zeus in different ways. Perhaps the most matter-of-fact and unemotional statement was made by Pausanias, the Greek traveler. He wrote, "The dimensions of Zeus in Olympia, both in height and width, have already been written down and are known to me. I will not, however, praise those who made the measurements, because the measurements are far less impressive than the effect the statue has on those who see it. They say that God himself bore witness to the artistic skill of Phidias. From when the image of Zeus was completed, Phidias prayed to God to send him a sign as to whether he liked the work, and at that very moment a thunderbolt flew from the sky. And when it comes to more extravagant praise, it will be hard for us to top the Greek philosopher Dion Chrysostom. Living at the end of the 1st century AD, Dion doesn't even so much describe the statue, he simply addresses the imaginary. Just listen to this praise. O best and noblest of artists, you have created a sweet and endearing sight, an inescapable delight to the sight for all those Greeks and non-Greeks who have come here on many different occasions. This no one can deny. Even the creatures in creation who have an irrational nature, animals would be overwhelmed if come once they could see this work of art. And among men, whoever, burdened with pain of his soul and has endured many miseries and sufferings of his life, could never attain to sweet sleep. Then even this man, standing before this image of Zeus, would forget all the terrible and heavy things one had to suffer in human life. In less solemn language, the encyclopedist Clinsius the Elder declared that Zeus in Olympia had no rival. Quintilian, a contemporary of Clinsius, believed that the majesty of the statue matched that of God himself. It seems that the beauty of Zeus has added something to traditional religion. To that extent, the majesty of the work is equal to that of Zeus. Phidias obviously did not have a physical model of Zeus to portray when he created the statue. As a result, some writers believe that he deliberately wanted to make the statue of Zeus unreal, to show a supposedly human but in fact unsurpassed in the beauty and perfection of God. Phidias's aim was to move from the realm of nature to that of the divine. Certainly, Cicero wrote, Phidias did not consider any human model from which they drew a likeness. Rather, some extraordinary vision of beauty resided in his mind, and by focusing his mind on it and imitating its nature, he directed his hand and his art towards creating a likeness from it. And the philosopher Plotinus even went further in his considerations. He believes that Phidias might even have gone beyond the physical sense in constructing the statue. Moving only in the realm of fantasy and imagination, tried at least to imagine what Zeus would have looked like if such an illustrious god had actually stooped to such a lowly act as appearing to mortals. Believe it or not, there were also critics who expressed reservations about Zeus as executed by Phidias. Diodorus of Sicily stressed that no work made by a mortal could be entirely without flaws. Strabon, on the other hand, remarked that the statue seemed too large for the temple in which it was placed. Another view we could even call somewhat jealous. Some argued that although the statue of Zeus was an extraordinary work, it was ordinary earthly art and not a divine miracle, while its creator was still a human artist, a mere craftsman who made art for a living. And according to Plutarch, for example, if a work of art delights because of its craftsmanship, this does not yet mean that the man who made it is immediately worthy of our respect. Such talk of Phidias as a mere craftsman and of his carved Zeus as mere art were not the dominant view in the ancient world. It seems that one reason for the existence of such negative critical views was to draw attention, even to shock. So what did the statue of Zeus made by Phidias look like? As I mentioned, it was almost 13 meters high. The robe and ornaments that Zeus wore and his hair were made of gold, and his skin was made of ivory. He had a wreath around his head, and in his right hand held a Nike statue. In his left hand he held a staff with an eagle on the end. The carved backrests and legs of the throne depicted figures of the deities and battle scenes. The throne of Zeus was made of cedar wood, lined with ebony and precious stones. The temple surrounding the statue was huge, and its surviving foundations measuring 64 by 27 meters. You might ask, why has the statue of Zeus not survived to this day? According to the Roman historian Suetonius, the Roman Emperor Caligula was the first to attempt to attack the statue. He issued an order to bring statues of the gods from Greece, all of them sacred or of artistic merit, then remove their heads and put casts of Caligula's head in their place. So Caligula's workers went to Olympia, but were allegedly horrified by the seated Zeus and fled in terror. The statue survived, but not for long. In 391 AD, the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius closed down the existing temples, including the one at Olympia, and thus the statue fell into oblivion. The circumstances of the statue's final deconstruction are unknown. The Byzantine historian Georgios Cedriminos records that it was taken to Constantinople, where it was destroyed in the Great Palace Fire of 475 AD. Another theory is that the statue was lost with the temple, which was destroyed in a fire in 425 AD. An even earlier destruction or robbery of the statue is suggested by a Greek poet, writing, "They laid hands on your person in Olympia, my Lord Thunderer, and you had no energy to wake the dogs or call your neighbors. Surely someone could have come to your aid and caught the carnage before they had even finished packing up the loot." Although the statue of Zeus was irretrievably lost, excavations in 1958 succeeded in discovering an authentic workshop of Phidias, more or less on the spot where, according to Pausanias, the statue of Zeus was built. Archaeological discoveries included material working tools, ivory fragments, and precious stones. A goblet with an inscription belonging to Phidias was also found at the site, but this inscription is widely regarded as a forgery. I myself very much regret that the statue is no longer with us, as I would have liked to seen it with my own eyes and form my own opinion about it. I am curious to know whether I would have been among those enthusiasts of Phidias' chisel, or rather among his detractors. But while we are on the subject of gods, I think it would be worth discussing an equally powerful female goddess. I invite you to another miracle, to the Temple of Artemis. Artemis in Greek religion is the goddess of wild animals, hunting, vegetation, and the patron of chastity and the protector of childbirth. Artemis was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, and the twin sister of Apollo. Among the rural population, Artemis was a favorite goddess. She was the protector of the wilderness, and, accompanied by nymphs, danced in the mountains, forests, and marshes. She traveled great distances at night and protected travelers and flocks. Artemis embodied the ideals and virtues of the hunter, so in addition to hunting game for food, she protected other animals, especially young ones. She was said to be the mistress of animals. Artemis was the patroness of forests, vegetation, and mountains throughout the Peloponnesus. Artemis oversaw the waters and lush wild vegetation. Poets and artists usually depicted her with a deer or hunting dog beside her. Given the many tales of amorous adventures of Artemis's nymphs, some assume that the accounts were originally told of the goddess herself. However, poets emphasized Artemis's purity and her delight in hunting with dance and music. And to this caring and virtuous goddess, it was decided to erect a suitable temple. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, located in the western part of present-day Turkey. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This temple was described by Philon of Byzantium. I saw both walls and the hanging gardens of ancient Babylon. I saw the statue of Zeus the Olympian, the Colossus of Rhodes. I saw the mighty work of the high pyramids and the tomb of Mausolus. But when I saw the temple of Ephesus rising to the clouds, all these other wonders were relegated to the shadows. The Temple of Artemis was said to be a fanciful structure made of marble with golden and silver decorations, the finest art and statues of the age. The fate of the temple is remarkable, and it is probably the only one of the wonders to have been destroyed and rebuilt so many times. According to estimates, this has happened more than 9 times. The first classical temple had a clay floor surrounded by a single row of columns. It was built in the second half of the 8th century BC. It was an architectural feat. The Temple of Ephesus was the earliest known example of a temple with columns on the coast of Asia Minor, and perhaps even the earliest Greek temple ever surrounded by columns. In the 7th century, however, a flood destroyed this temple, depositing more than 1 meter of mud and sand. It was probably then that the wooden statue of Artemis collapsed and was buried under a layer of mud. But there was also a positive aspect to the fact that the flood hit the temples. The mud well preserved all kinds of treasures buried in it, with real rarities. For example, a carved ivory tablet depicting a griffin, a legendary monster with the head and wings of an eagle and the body of a lion. There was also a tablet of the Tree of Life in the rubble. What's more, the flood deposits buried and thus preserved the precious find of tear-shaped amber drops, which once adorned the image of Artemis. This new temple, which was already known as a miracle, was built around 550 BC and was constructed by the Cretan architect Hierophron and his son Metagenes. It was much more opulent and more elaborate than the previous one. The reconstruction was supported by the Croesus of the rich king of Lydia. The new temple was built of marble and its columns were doubled to create a wide ceremonial passage around the central classical temple. The new statue of Artemis was made of grapewood and was to have a dignified environment, an environment worthy of the Lady of Animals herself. According to Plinius the Elder, the Ionian-style temple was built of marble and cedar on marshy ground, so that it would not feel the shocks nor the cracking of the earth's crust, and so that the foundations of such an immensity would not stand in slippery and solid ground. A layer of crushed coal was sprinkled on the underside, then swept with sheep fleece. The temple was 110 meters long and 55 meters wide. It also had 127 20-meter-high ornate columns. To add to its splendor, it was surrounded by paintings and sculptures by the most excellent masters, Phidias, Scopas, and Praxiteles. The temple quickly became an ancient tourist attraction, visited by merchants, kings, and travelers, many of whom paid homage in the form of jewelry and various goods. It was also a widely respected place of refuge, which in myth was likened to the Amazons, who is said to have taken refuge there from both Heracles and Dionysus. It was in this restored edition that the temple went down in the annals of history as a wonder of the world. It was not for long, however, that the newly rebuilt temple was to please the eyes of travelers. It was set on fire on the 21st of July, 356 BC. The instigator of this crime was a certain Herostrates, whose motive was for him to gain fame, even at the highest price. As it was written, a man was found who planned to burn down the temple so that by destroying this most beautiful building, his name would spread throughout the world. The citizens of Ephesus were outraged by this deed. They wished that not only should the criminal be sentenced to death, but more than that, his name should never be recorded anywhere so as to inflict upon him the punishment he feared most. That history would forget him, that his name would not survive. He was fortunate, however, as one historian, Strabon, later recorded his name so that it is still known today. So too, the deed of Herostratus lives on to this day. However, this is not the end of the turbulent fate of the temple. On the same night that the temple was destroyed, somewhere far away in the world, Alexander the Great was born. Plutarch said that Artemis had the choice of watching over the birth of the great Alexander or saving his burning temple, and she chose the former. Alexander, when he had grown up, later offered to pay for the rebuilding of the temple. Eventually, the temple was rebuilt, but was not until after Alexander the Great's death in 323 BC. It seemed that only better times lay ahead for the temple when the reign of the Romans arrived. The site flourished. The Romans had many counterparts to the Greek deities, including Diana, who in the Roman order was identified with Artemis. Unfortunately, this once again reconstructed temple was destroyed during the invasion of the Goths in 262 BC. The historian Jordanes wrote down the leaders of the Goths, who took a ship and sailed across the straits to Asia, where they ravaged many cities and set fire to the famous temple of Diana in Ephesus. The Goths had no mercy for statues or buildings or ornaments. Soon again, the palace of worship of Artemis became a burnt-out place. However, the temple was once again rebuilt and was known as one of the wonders of the world until the Christian times, with its final destruction caused not by the pagans, but by a Christian archbishop. So how did this happen? First, I have two biblical parables for you to outline the background. Earlier, Christians also carried out their missionary and conversion work in Asia, including the area of present-day Turkey, for example. In the Bible, in the Acts of the Apostles, we read that craftsmen in Asia began to worry that sales of religious paraphernalia dedicated to Artemis and her temple would fall if only people stopped believing in her, abandoning their old beliefs for the new Christian God. That is why, on one occasion, an Ephesian mob attacked St. Paul's traveling companions. A scuffle and then a riot ensued, during which the Ephesians chanted, "Great is the Artemis of Ephesus." St. Paul was saved from death by one city official, who claimed the crown by explaining to everyone that Christian teaching was not really any real threat. The official said, "Does not the whole world know that the city of Ephesus is the guardian of the temple of the great Artemis and its image?" The second anecdote concerning the temple appears in the New Testament Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are books that are not part of the official canon of the Bible, and it is the apocryphal Acts of the Apostles written in the 2nd and 3rd century AD that provide much interesting data about the life of the early church, including liturgical customs. According to the Acts of John, Saint John prayed publicly in the temple of Artemis. While exorcising her demons, suddenly the altar of Artemis broke into many pieces and half the temple collapsed, converting the terrified Ephesians. Even if the Apocrypha were exaggerated, surely Artemis herself did not have the power to stop the winds of historical change. The facts are that by the 4th century AD, Christianity had become the state religion of the Roman Empire. Most Ephesians converted to Christianity, and in 391, Theodosius was the first to announce the closure of the pagan temples. 10 years later came, and the end of the abandoned place of worship of Artemis. In 401, the temple was finally destroyed by a Christian mob inspired by St. John Chrysostom, who had recently arrived in Ephesus as its archbishop. St. John Chrysostom led a mob of Christians to plunder and demolish pagan places of worship. Marble stones from the temple of Artemis were used to construct other buildings, and some of the columns of the Hagia Sophia originally belonged to the temple of Artemis. The ancient city and the ruins of the temple disappeared under a thick layer of yellow silt carried by the Kaistros River. The temple site was rediscovered in 1869 by an expedition sponsored by the British Museum. Only one column remains of the temple itself. I have left you with a certain irony at the end of this story. It could be said that although the temple of Artemis collapsed, Ephesus came full circle historically. In 431 AD, Ephesus hosted the Universal Council, during which the Christian bishops gave Mary, the mother of Jesus, the title of Divine Parent. In this way, ancient Ephesus remained a goddess city until the end of its history. And so ended the story of the beautiful house of Artemis. So, what do you say to moving now to a more dark funeral atmosphere? Let's change the mood. I invite you to Halicarnassus, where we will visit the mausoleum of Mausolus. Death is one of those things that the rich and the poor have in common, but mankind has always tried, even to this final stage of the earthly journey, to distinguish itself at least a little from others, to emphasize its uniqueness. Thus, for example, while we usually bury loved ones beneath tombstones today, stately tombs are still built. Tombstones are larger than standard single gravestones. They are distinguished by their more complex design, method of construction, size, and price. Several deceased people can rest in tombs. Simply open the entrance to place another urn or coffin inside. Tombs are much more expensive than a single tombstone, especially if you go for the use of high-quality raw material. Above all, however, tombs are conspicuous to all who visit the cemetery. But if the grave is an ordinary family car and the tomb is a premium limousine, then a mausoleum is the equivalent of a private luxury jet. A mausoleum is a particularly grandiose, elaborate tomb. The mass of a mausoleum is usually monumental. It is a separate building with rich architectural decoration, and whether we like such splendor or not, a mausoleum is often the size of a single family house or even a block of flats. Similarly, special is the name itself, mausoleum. Why is it called that? The name came into common use in the 19th century after the discovery of the ruins of the 4th century BC tomb erected for a Persian satrap and his wife. The great and magnificently decorated building was so improbably grand that it was soon recognized as one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. We're talking about the Mausoleum of Halicarnassus, the final resting place of Mausolus and Artemisia. The Mausoleum of Mausolus is a tomb built between 353 and 350 BC in Halicarnassus. It is now Bodrum in Turkey. It was built for a couple, for Mausolus, the governor in the Persian Empire, and Artemisia, his wife, who was also his birth sister. It was customary in the Kari dynasty for rulers to marry their sisters. Such incestuous marriages thus maintained power and wealth in the family. The building was designed by Greek architects Statiros and Patios. The mausoleum was 41 meters high, and each of its 4 sides was decorated with reliefs created by famous Greek sculptors. It was no longer a tomb, it was actually a small skyscraper, tall even by today's urban standards. Just imagine resting after death in such a place, visible not so much from the whole cemetery, but from the whole city. When completed, the structure was considered such a great aesthetic triumph that the ancient historian Antipater of Sidon declared it as one of his 7 wonders of the ancient world. Since then, the word mausoleum has been used generically for any great tomb. How did it come about that such a gigantic tomb was built? Halicarnassus was the capital of a small region and kingdom on the Anatolian coast. In 377 BC, Hecatomnus, the local governor under the Persians, took control of several neighboring cities and districts. In the same year, Hecatomnus died and left control of the kingdom to his son Mausolus. It was Mausolus who extended the territory as far as the southwestern coast of Anatolia. Mausolus and Artemisia ruled from Halicarnassus over the surrounding territory for 24 years. Mausolus, although descended from the local Persian population, spoke Greek and admired the Greek way of life and government. He founded many cities of Greek design and encouraged the spread of Greek democratic traditions. Mausolus finally decided to make Halicarnassus a place of safe, as unconquerable and as magnificent as no other in the world. Halicarnassus was to be a capital worthy only of himself. Workers dredged the city's harbor, built breakwaters, and fortified it. On land, squares were paved, streets and houses for the citizens were built, and on one side of the harbor, a massive palace fortress was built for Mausolus. From this palace, having a good view from the sea and inland, the enemy's moves could be clearly seen. Walls and watchtowers, a Greek-style theater, and temples to Ares, the Greek god of war, were also built. Mausolus and Artemisia spent huge sums to beautify the city. They commissioned statues, temples, and buildings of gleaming marble. And in the center of the city, Mausolus planned to build a resting place for himself after death. It was to be a tomb that would forever commemorate his glory and that of his wife. Unfortunately, in 353 BC, Mausolus died, leaving Artemisia with a broken heart. In tribute to him, Artemisia decided to make the tomb he had planned even more magnificent, even more perfect, so that his name would forever be associated with the most magnificent of tombs. However, soon after construction began, the reclusive Artemisia ran into trouble. The Greek island of Rhodos in the Aegean Sea had not long before been conquered by Mausolus. When the Rhodians learnt of his death, they revolted and sent a fleet of ships to capture the city of Halicarnassus. Seeing that the Rhodian fleet was on its way, Artemisia hid her own ships in a secretive place at the eastern end of the harbour. When the Rhodian fleet troops moved to attack, Artemisia's fleet made a surprise raid and took over the Rhodian fleet. It didn't end there. Artemisia put her own soldiers on the captured ships and sailed them back to Rhodos. Confused that the returning ships were their own Rhodians, they failed to defend themselves and the city was retaken, crushing the rebellion. Artemisia therefore had reason to celebrate. She had defended Mausolus's legacy. She had shown that although he was no longer with his body, his soul still cared for his subjects and his kingdom. She therefore spared no expense in building her beloved's tomb and sent messengers to Greece to find the most talented artists of the time. Among them was Scopas, the man who oversaw the rebuilding of the temple of Artemis. He was joined by other famous sculptors, as well as hundreds of other craftsmen. The result of the whole operation was the largest tomb in the world. Only the pyramids have been a bigger burial place. The mausoleum was erected on a hill towering over the city. The entire structure was located in an enclosed courtyard and could be roughly divided into three parts. The first third was the stone platform on which the tomb stood. This platform along its outer walls had many statues or goddesses and gods. Each corner of the tomb was guarded by stone warriors on horseback. The stairs were guarded by stone lions. The central part to which the stairs led was the marble tomb itself. This part was covered with reliefs depicting action scenes, such as the Battle of the Centaurs and the Greeks in battle with the Amazons. There were also 36 slender columns. Between each column stood a different statue. Behind the columns was a solid block that bore the weight of the tomb's massive roof. The roof, which made up most of the last third of its height, was pyramidal in shape. In turn, it was topped by four massive horses pulling a chariot in which images of Mausolus and Artemisia rode. Artemisia lived only 2 years after her husband's death. She did not live to see the full effect of her efforts, while the urns containing their ashes were placed in a tomb that was still unfinished. A large number of animals were sacrificed on the steps leading to the tomb, and then the steps were filled with stones and rubble, closing off access to the tomb. The mausoleum towered over Halicarnassus for many centuries. It was intact when the city fell prey to Alexander the Great in 334 BC and was still undamaged after pirate attacks in the middle of the 1st century BC. It stood over the ruins of the city for 16 centuries. Unfortunately, a series of earthquakes shattered the columns and sent the structure's crowning marble chariot to the ground in 1404. Only the very base of the structure could now be seen. The further fate of the mausoleum is even sadder. At the beginning of the 15th century in the Middle Ages, the Knights of the Sovereign Chivalric Order of the Hospitallers of St. John, also known as the Knights of St. John or the Knights of Malta, invaded the region and built a massive castle. When the Johnites decided to fortify it in 1494, they used the stones from the mausoleum in 1522. Rumors of a Turkish invasion caused the Crusaders to reinforce the castle in Halicarnassus, and much of the remaining parts of the tomb were broken up and used in the castle walls. Fragments of marble from the tomb can still be seen there today. In an interesting story that took place, a group of knights entered the mausoleum and discovered a roof containing a large coffin. However, this group decided that it was already too dark and too late to open this coffin, so they would return the next morning to continue their exploration. To their surprise, they found the tomb and all the treasures ransacked. The bodies of Mausolus and Artemisia were also missing. The knights concluded that Muslim local farmers were responsible for the theft, but it was just as likely that the Crusaders had looted the tombs themselves. It is only clear from research carried out by archaeologists in the 1960s that long before the arrival of the knights, unknown robbers had dug a tunnel under the tomb chamber, getting inside and stealing its contents. It is also most likely that Mausolus and Artemisia were cremated after their deaths, so only the urns containing their ashes were placed in the tomb chamber. This explains why no bodies were found. Today, the massive castle of the Knights of Malta still stands in Bodrum, and the polished stone and marble blocks of the mausoleum can be seen embedded in the walls of the building. Where the mausoleum was located, today there are only foundations and a small museum. The beauty of the mausoleum lay not only in its construction itself, but also in the decorations and statues that adorn the exterior at different levels. Statues of people, lions and horses and other animals in different scales. The Greek sculptors who carved these statues were responsible for each of the 4 sides of the mausoleum. I think to myself that the greatest miracle of the mausoleum of Halicarnassus is that although Mausolus did not remain with us physically, by the very name of its burial place, it will forever remain in the history of the world. And to this day, when you set out to visit other places on the globe and someone tells you about any other mausoleum, you will already know that there once was one particular mausoleum from which all the others took their source and inspiration. We now move on to perhaps the most epic of the wonders, for there is something about it that humbles me more than the pyramids or the seated Zeus, for the name itself inspires awe. I cannot wait to tell you the story of the Colossus of Rhodos. If I were to ask you what was the most famous monument in the world today, I'm sure most of you would say the Statue of Liberty, visible in hundreds of paintings, dozens of pictures, and immortalized in dozens of films. This statue on Liberty Island is a symbol of freedom, a symbol of New York, and a symbol of the United States. The monumental neoclassical statue was erected in the late 19th century. It was a gift from the French people to the American people, commemorating the alliance of the 2 nations during the American War of Independence. However, the Statue of Liberty had inspiration from elsewhere. It was the Colossus of Rhodos. It was a giant statue of the Greek god Helios, erected on the Greek island of Rhodes by Charles of Lindos. Erected between 292 and 280 BC, the Colossus of Rhodos was about 33 meters high, which makes it the tallest statue of the ancient world. At the same time, it was about the same size as the Statue of Liberty. Surely you are familiar with the image of the Colossus of Rhodos. The statue of a man standing above the entrance of a harbor holding a flame in his hand. This giant silhouette could be seen from many kilometers away. There is probably no wonder more appealing to the imagination than this one. Well, at least to me. Helios was not an accidental choice for the figure of the Colossus guarding the harbor in Greek religion and mythology. Helios was a god and personification of the sun and one of the Titans. The Titans were giant gods that existed before the Olympian gods. Helios was often given the name Hyperion, meaning the one above, and Pantheon, meaning the shining one. Helios was often depicted in art with a radiant crown and chariot gliding through the sky. He was the guardian of oaths and also the god of sight, according to ancient Greek beliefs. Helios traversed the daytime sky in a golden chariot, harnessed with 4 white horses. He began his journey in the east and ended it on the second side of the horizon in the west, where he bathed his horses in the Oceaneos. No wonder then that the mighty Helios was chosen by the inhabitants of Rhodes to be the protector of their city, just after Rhodes had successfully repelled an attack by a powerful army. How did this happen? Alexander the Great died in Babylon in 323 BC. At that time, he was the king of the whole known world, a god, an excellent ruler and general, although he was barely 33 years old. During his short life, he had conquered almost every state and nation known to the geography of the time. Alexander, however, wanted more. From Babylon, he floated plans to conquer Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, and beyond. Unfortunately, death awaits everyone, and so far no one has outwitted it. We do not know what caused Alexander's death, perhaps illness, perhaps poisoning. Similarly, however, we do not know what the fate of the empire would have been had he left a worthy heir. Unfortunately, his only son, also named Alexander, was born after his father's death, which did not allow him to inherit the empire. To make matters worse, Alexander the Great said before his death that his empire after his death belonged to the bravest of the generals, and as each of his generals considered himself to be the bravest, there were wars between the Macedonian generals and the division of the state into the Ptolemaic, Seleucid, and Antigonid kingdoms, eternally at war with each other. During the battles, Rhodos sided with the Ptolemies, and when they finally took control of Egypt, the two formed a strong alliance and controlled most of the trade in the eastern Mediterranean. Shortly afterwards, another of Alexander's generals, Antigonus, called Cyclops because of his lack of one eye, planned to set out for Egypt. But Rhodos, which was in alliance with Egypt, protested. This turn of events upset Antigonus. In 305 BC, he ordered his son Demetrius to attack Rhodos. Demetrius took an army of 40,000 men. The aim was to unite the empire and prove that Alexander had left a worthy successor after all. Rhodos was well defended, however, so Demetrius had to start building massive siege towers to break through the walls of Rhodos. It was not for nothing that Demetrius was nicknamed the Sieger of Cities. The machines built by Demetrius were enormous. The first tower was mounted on 6 ships, but these were capsized in a storm and sunk. Although the attack with a mighty tower failed, Demetrius was already preparing for the next episode of assault on Rhodos with the largest siege machine in the world, Heliopolis, known as the Conqueror of Cities. Actually, it is difficult to call the Heliopolis a siege machine. It was a mobile assault skyscraper. The Heliopolis was built on pine trunks and rolled on metal wheels. Its height was 40 meters, with a side length of 20 meters, and the weight was about 150 tons. It had as many as 9 floors or levels. Each level of the Heliopolis was equipped with a side staircase that allowed movement up and down at the same side on each level. There was also catapults and ballistas. The highest platforms were for javelineers and archers to fire at the city's defenders. The front of the tower was fortified by metal plates that protected the machinery from bullets and fire, while the firing holes were covered by shutters moved by ropes. The Heliopolis was pushed by 3,000 people. Although slow, it was deadly. The Rhodians knew if Heliopolis reached the walls of the city, it would mean its downfall. The attackers would easily get over the city walls and the defenses would fall. There are 2 versions of what further happened during the siege of Rhodos. The first, less spectacular one, was that the Heliopolis was driven towards the city. The Rhodians managed to destroy some of the metal plates, which meant that suddenly the wood from which the structure was built became an easy target for burning projectiles. Demetrius ordered the machine to be withdrawn from the battle to save it from burning. After the siege of Heliopolis failed, it and the other machines were abandoned, and the people of Rhodes melted down its metal plating and sold it, using the materials and money to build a statue of their patron god Helios, the Colossus of Rhodos, which became known as one of the ancient 7 wonders of the world. There is also an alternative story proposed by Vitruvius. In this story, Rhodians begged Diognesus, once Rhodians' urban architect, to discover a way to defeat the oncoming Heliopolis. Under the cover of darkness, Diognetus had the Rhodians punch a hole in the city wall to direct large amounts of water, mud and sewage to the area where the Heliopolis was expected to attack the following day. Diognetus was successful. Heliopolis became bogged down in the wet ground and was unable to move even a millimeter towards the walls. After the siege was over, the Rhodians sold the abandoned siege machine to Demetrius and used the money to erect the huge Colossus of Rhodes. Whichever version is true, we know one thing. To celebrate their victory, the Rhodians sold the equipment left behind by the invaders and decided to build a colossal statue for their patron Helios. Construction was left to the direction of Shahs of Lindos, who had already worked on large-scale statues. The construction of the Colossus consumed all the money obtained from the sale of every piece of siege equipment that Demetrius had left behind. Such a great success indeed required a dignified celebration. After 12 years of construction, the statue was finally completed in 280 BC. It had a bronze core and was reinforced with iron. Almost 13 tons of bronze and 8 tons of iron were used in its construction. The metal shell was filled with clay and stones to ensure the stability of the structure. The Colossus was 32 meters high and stood next to the Mandracian harbor. During its construction, mounds of earth were strewn around the sides of the Colossus to support the structure. To observers, it looked as if Helios was emerging from a volcano. Once the construction was complete, all the supporting mounds were removed and the Colossus was left alone, gazing out at sea. Often in paintings we see the Colossus standing, flailing between one harbour entrance and another. It is in this straddled position that the Colossus had mostly penetrated the public consciousness, and I bet it is in this version that you also associate it with the ships entering and leaving from under its feet. Many cultural works also view the Colossus in this way. For example, in the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, Cassius says of Caesar, "Caesar, like a colossus, the whole world encircled. We crawl like dwarves at his feet, seeking a grave for our infamy." Unfortunately, it is likely that the Colossus did not stand perched between the entrances to the harbour, but simply with its legs together on a plinth. Engineers and mechanics believe that if the statue were to stand apart, the entire harbour entrance would have been effectively closed for the duration of the construction period, and it is difficult to imagine such a 12-year sacrifice to the local economy. Moreover, the harbour would certainly have required redredging after such a period of time, and the Rhodians of the time had neither the technology nor the resources to effectively dredge and reopen the harbour after such a long construction period. Most importantly, the statue was made mainly of bronze, and the engineering analysis indicated that the Colossus could not have been built with its legs apart, as it would have collapsed from its own weight. The imposing Colossus stood for 56 years until Rhodos was struck by an earthquake in 224 BC. The statue broke at the knees and toppled to the ground. Ptolemy III offered to pay to rebuild the statue, but the Rhodians were frightened that they must have offended Helios, and that is why it collapsed. They therefore refused to rebuild it, not wanting to further irritate the god. The remains of the Colossus lay on the ground for 800 years, and even the broken parts of the Colossus were so impressive that many traveled to see it. Pliny the Elder wrote that few people were even able to put their arms around the statue's broken thumb, and that each of the fingers of the Colossus was larger than most of the other statues in the world. As the chronicler Theophanes records, the metal remains of the Colossus were sold to a travelling salesman who had the metal pieces broken into even smaller pieces and transported on the backs of 800 camels to his home. And so the Colossus of Rhodes was irretrievably lost. In 1989, it was reported that large stones found on the seabed of Rhodos were the remains of the Colossus. However, this theory was later rejected by most scholars. Perhaps the most famous reference of the Colossus is in the poem New Colossus by Emma Lazarus. This is a poem written in 1883 and uniquely placed on a plaque for the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbor. Kamila Slowinska wrote about Emma Lazarus as follows. This lady managed to encapsulate in just 14 lines the most seductive and immortal myth of America, the promise of a new homeland. In my opinion, this poem perfectly references the Rhodesian original, but at the same time emphasizes that the Statue of Liberty is a monument of a completely different nature, not defensive but inviting. Let me quote this short piece about the Statue of Liberty, and at the same time about the Colossus of Rhodos. Not like a Greek god, but of a bronze cast, with feet on either side of the sea. A young, strong woman holding torches stands proudly at the harbour gate, and the light of her torch is lightning captured. Fleeing the oppressed of her name, for she protects. She proclaims hospitality to all who have escaped the chase and come to the land of the unknown. Give me only your poor multitudes, I will embrace them all with my hospitable arms. Send me the homelessness multitudes, for them I raise my lamp over the harbour waters. I have a feeling that the Colossus of Rhodes is not only my favourite wonder of the world. Indeed, there has been a lot of debate for a long time about whether the Colossus should be rebuilt. Those in favour of the idea say it would greatly increase tourism to Rhodos, but those against it say it would cost over $134 million. The idea has been revived from time to time, and it was first proposed in 1970. In December 2015, however, the group of European architects announced plans to build a modern colossus. It would stand perched at the entrance to the harbour, despite all of evidence and scholarly opinion that the original statue could not stand that way. The new statue would be 150 meters high, 5 times the height of the original, and would cost almost $300 million. The project was to be funded by private donations and crowdfunding. The statue was to include a cultural center, a library, an exhibition hall, and a lighthouse. Everything was to be powered by solar panels. At the moment, no such plans have come to fruition, and the project website at the time of writing this episode is defunct. Perhaps it would be better to keep it that way. In the meantime, we remain in maritime climate for the last wonder of the lighthouse in Pharos. Let me start with a quote that will explain why the lighthouse at Pharos or the lighthouse of Alexandria was necessary. I give the floor to the Greek historian Diodorus of Sicily. The journey among the Mediterranean coast is extremely long, and any mooring is particularly difficult, as from Libya to Syria, which is a journey along an 8,000-kilometer-long coast. No safe harbour can be found, except in the Pharos. In addition, a sandy coastal ribbon stretches practically the entire length of Egypt, impossible to spot for those who approach without previous experience in these waters. As a result, those who think they have avoided the dangers of the sea and in their ignorance head merrily towards the shore, suffer unexpected disaster when their ship suddenly runs aground, and sailors who cannot see land in time are thrown ashore before they realize it. Located in the port of Alexandria on the small coast inlet of Pharos, the most famous lighthouse in antiquity was a technological masterpiece of the age and a model for all future lighthouses. Also known as the Lighthouse on Pharos, it had an estimated height of 116 to 134 meters and for many centuries was among the tallest man-made structures on Earth. Its height is almost 3 times that of today's lighthouses. At the time, only the Great Pyramid at Giza was a taller man-made structure. It is no wonder, then, that the ancients considered such a grand structure to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. Alexandria was a flourishing Greek-Roman city located on the Mediterranean coast of Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great in the ancient world. It was a well-known international center of culture and science. The Lighthouse of Alexandria was originally built as a landmark rather than an actual lighthouse and was known by the name of the surrounding island on which it was located, Pharos. Greek historian and biographer Plutarch mentions that Alexander, being so captivated by Egypt, decided to found a large Greek city to bear his name by the advice of his architects. Alexander measured and enclosed the area intended for him. At night, as he slept, he experienced a miraculous vision. A man with windswept hair and a respected appearance stood by his side and recited these verses. In the vast sea there is an island in front of Egypt. Pharos it is called, Pharos by the people. This is a small island just off the coast of Alexandria, with only a small link to the mainland, as the Egyptian coast is very flat and there are no landmarks to use for navigation either. It was felt necessary to place some sort of marker at the front of the Alexandrian harbour. It is most likely that the use of the lighthouse as a beacon, with fires and mirrors reflecting the light on top, only started around the 1st century BC during the Roman period. In the meantime, however, Pharos only served as a navigational marker and a prominent height tower on the horizon. Some descriptions state that there was still a huge statue above the Pharos lighthouse, probably depicting Alexander the Great. Then how was such a huge lighthouse built? The lighthouse building itself was designed by Sostratos of Kindos in the 3rd century BC. It is possible that the originator of the construction of the lighthouse was Alexander the Great himself. After his unexpected death, Ptolemy became king in 305 and ordered the construction of the lighthouse on Pharos to begin. According to legend, Sostratos was forbidden by Ptolemy to sign his name anywhere on the work, not even a small plaque with his name on it. But the architect disobeyed the order, and although he placed an inscription praising King Ptolemy on the surface of the thick plaster, deeper beneath the top plaster the following inscription was carved. Sostratos, son of Dixivanus of Kindos, salutes all sailors and asks the guards to look after them. Years later, the plaster wiped away, revealing Sostratos' name. Legend says that the beam of the light from Pharos was so powerful that it allowed enemy ships to be set on fire before they could even reach the shore. This is unlikely due to the relatively poor quality of optics and technology at the time. In all probability, it is estimated that the light from the lighthouse could be seen up to 50 kilometers from the shore. The mighty white marble building consisted of a total of 3 parts. On the foundations, measuring 30 by 30 meters, rose a tapering cuboid 70 meters high. The second part of the lighthouse, more than 30 meters high, was built on an octagonal base, and the last third part was 7 meters high and cylindrical. Daylight reached the interior of the tower through numerous windows inside, which led to the top by a spiral staircase. In total, the structure was up to 130 meters, the height of a 40-story skyscraper. In the highest part of the lighthouse, there was a place for a huge bonfire lit at night and for a huge mirror reflecting light, visible within the aforementioned 50-kilometer radius. During the day, smoke was the identifying signal, spreading over the tower. The walls of Pharos were reinforced to withstand the impact of waves. Molten lead was used for this. As a result, the building survived the longest of the 7 wonders, with the exception of the Great Pyramid in Giza. The lighthouse was still standing when a Muslim traveler, Ibn Battuta, visited the city in 1183. Unfortunately, the lighthouse tower was severely damaged by 2 earthquakes in the early 14th century. So much so that the Arab traveler reported that he was no longer able to enter the ruins of the lighthouse. Even the vestial remains disappeared for good in the late 15th century, when the then Sultan of Egypt built a fort on the former site of the lighthouse, using some of the fallen stones. The remains of the Pharos have been incorporated into the walls of the Kite Bay Fort, which is still standing today and are very clearly visible due to their excessive size compared to the rest of the building blocks of this fort. In 1994, hundreds of huge masonry blocks were discovered on the seabed off Pharos. A brief verification gave cause for rejoicing that these were the lighthouse fragments. Further research confirmed that at least some of these blocks may have fallen into the sea when an earthquake destroyed the lighthouse in 1300. In the late 20th century, there were many proposals to replace the lighthouse with a modern reconstruction. In 2015, the Egyptian government approved a large-scale reconstruction of the ancient lighthouse, with plans to build a multi-story copy of the lighthouse where it stood in ancient times. Interestingly, the project envisages the construction of an underwater glass hall at a depth of 3 meters, so that all amateur historians can see the ruins of the ancient world. And while this attempt to bring the lighthouse at Pharos back to life has not yet succeeded, let us remember that in some ways the lighthouse is still with us to this day. In fact, Pharos became the source of the word for lanterns in many languages. Is it possible to create a new list of the 7 wonders of the world? With complete freedom, do these such places or objects deserve to be called wonders today? Well, in the year 2000, a Swiss foundation launched a campaign to select the new 7 wonders of the world. Given that this original list of the 7 wonders of the world was created in the 2nd century BC and that only one of them is still standing, being the pyramids, it seemed time to update the list. People all over the world were in agreement, as more than 100 million votes were cast online or by text message. However, the final results, which were announced in 2007, were met with both joy and criticism. Many famous sites, such as the Athenian Acropolis, are not on the new list. I will present this list to you. I'm curious to see if anything on it coincides with your choices. Topping the new 7 wonders of the world is the Great Wall of China. It is one of the world's largest construction projects. It is about 8,850 kilometers long. Work on it began in the 7th century BC and took 2,000 years to complete. Although called a wall, this structure consists of 2 parallel walls in long sections. Watchtowers and barracks are placed along the entire length of the Chinese wall. Although majestic, this wall was not very effective. It was built to prevent invasions and raids, but never really provided real security. Instead, it served more as political propaganda. At number 2 on the new list is Chichen Itza. This Mayan city is on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Its heyday was in the 9th and 10th centuries AD under the Mayan rule of the Inca tribe, who were heavily influenced by the Toltecs. Many stunning monuments and temples were built, and among the most notable is the stepped pyramid of El Castillo, or the castle. It rises to a height of 24 meters, a testament to the Mayans' considerable astronomical skills. The structure has a total of 365 degrees, which corresponds to the number of days in the solar year. During the vernal autumnal equinoxes, the setting sun casts shadows on the pyramid, making it appear as if a serpent slithers down the northern staircase, while at the base of the pyramid is the stone head of a snake. Coming in at number 3 on the new 7 Wonders of the World list is Petra, the Rock City. The ancient city of Petra in Jordan is situated in a rocky valley accessed by a narrow road among the rocks. Petra is famous for its numerous buildings carved into the rocks. It is said to have been one of the places where Moses struck a rock and water gushed out. Later, the Nabateans, an Arab tribe, made it their capital, and during this time Petra flourished, becoming an important center of trade, especially in spices. Nabatean skilled sculptors carved houses, temples, and tombs in sandstone, and these changed color under the changing sun. Petra also had a water system that allowed for lush gardens and crops in its heyday, while this rock city had a population of 30,000. However, it began to decline when trade routes changed. A major earthquake in the mid-4th century and another in the mid-6th century caused Petra to be gradually abandoned, although it was rediscovered in 1912 and was largely ignored by archaeologists until the late 20th century. Many questions about this rock city remain unresolved to this day. In 4th place on the new list is Machu Picchu, which is an Inca city near Cusco in Peru, which was discovered in 1911 and initially believed to be a secret Inca fortress used during a revolt against Spanish rule in the 16th century, although this claim was later disproved. To this day, it remains questionable to scholars. Its discovery believed it was home to the Virgins of the Sun, women who lived in monasteries under vows of chastity. Others believe it was probably a pilgrimage site. Some believe it may have been a royal refuge. It is known that Machu Picchu is one of the few large pre-Columbian ruins that have been found in almost intact condition. Despite its relative isolation high in the Andes, it has terraces of agricultural plazas, residential areas, and temples. In 5th place, the Christ the Redeemer statue in Rio de Janeiro is a colossal statue of Jesus that stands atop the Corcovado mountain in Rio de Janeiro. Its creation dates back to just after the First World War, when some Brazilians feared a wave of godlessness. It was proposed that a statue be erected to combat this threat to the faith. Construction began in 1926 and was completed 5 years later. The resulting statue is 30 meters high. This does not count the base, which is about 8 meters. The outstretched arms of Christ are 28 meters wide. The statue is made of reinforced concrete and is covered with 6 million tiles. The statue is often struck by lightning, and in 2014, the tip of Jesus' right thumb was damaged in a storm. Interestingly, a taller Christ statue was erected in Świebodzin, Poland in 2010. The Świebodzin Christ is 33 meters tall, which is 3 meters more than the one in Rio. The penultimate site is the Colosseum in Rome. The structure was built in the 1st century by order of Emperor Vespasian. The amphitheater measures 189 by 156 meters and had an intricate system of vaults which were able to accommodate 50,000 spectators to watch various events. The most notable were the gladiator fights, although animal fights also occurred. In addition, water was sometimes pumped into the Colosseum for staged sea battles. The scale of what went on in the Colosseum is incomprehensible. According to some estimates, around 500,000 people died in the Colosseum. In addition, so many animals were captured and killed there that some species are said to have even become extinct. Ending off the list of the 7 new wonders of the world is the Taj Mahal. This complex of 4 buildings in India is considered one of the world's most iconic monuments. It is arguably the finest example of East Asian architecture. The Taj Mahal was built on the orders of the emperor to honor his wife, Mumtaz Mahal. His wife died in 1631, giving birth to their 14th child. The construction of the complex, which includes a huge garden with a swimming pool, took about 22 years to build, required the work of 20,000 laborers, and converted to today's figures, cost the equivalent of $1 billion. The Taj Mahal is made of white marble, which contains semi-precious stones cut in geometric and floral patterns. Its majestic central dome is surrounded by 4 smaller domes. According to some reports, the emperor wanted to have his own mausoleum made of black marble, but this was overthrown by one of his sons before any work could begin. This is what the new list of the 7 wonders of the world looks like today. My dear friends, thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed listening to today's episode. If you did, please subscribe to the channel and give it a like, or send it to a friend who is passionate about history. I'll catch you again in the next History Podcast.